So yeah, we had a similar kind of event yesterday evening.
We're okay for time actually, if you want a bit longer.
Okay, all right, thank you. And to be honest, I was in somewhat of a state of shock yesterday because we'd only heard that morning that Banti had died, and it was quite sudden. And as I was walking in this morning into town, I remembered what the Buddha had said when his two chief disciples, Maha Modgalyayana and Shariputra, died. One died after the other. They died before the Buddha. And he said there's an emptiness in his life now that they've gone. So he felt that. He felt the lack of his two great friends, Shariputra and Maha Modgalyayana. Someone new coming in. Go on in. And as I was walking in this morning, I felt, oh yeah, that's exactly how I feel actually. That there's a great big gap, hole in my life now that Banti is gone. In a way, we won't, the movement and the order as institutions, I don't think we'll feel it very much because for the last 20 years of his life, he was preparing us for this, and he went to great lengths to prepare us, so we're prepared for this. But of course, emotionally, we may not be so prepared. And it only began to dawn on me overnight that actually, I've lost a really, really good friend, a very constant friend for the last 45 years of my life, really. And I was saying last night that he was unfailingly kind to me throughout the whole time. The whole time that I knew him, he was always kind and always encouraging. He was really, really good to me, and I know he was very good to many other people. Also, I was thinking this morning as I came in that what a remarkable life he led. Very, very remarkable and highly unusual as well. I mean, many of you know the story, so I won't go into it in great detail. But, brought up in Tooting, that's not so remarkable, London. And he had a heart condition, so much so that his doctor ordered him, if he exerted himself, he could become very ill or even die. So he was ordered bed rest, and he was in bed for 2 years, at home, not in hospital, but his own home. And during that time, he made really great use of that time. He educated himself. He read Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy. He read about religion. He read literature, history. He really educated himself during that time. He's got a very, very thorough and deep education. And later on, of course, maybe it was just a bit later than that, but he bought a book in a local bookshop. It was two things in one. It was the Diamond Sutra and the Sutra Hui Neng. And he read them, and he had deep insight into the Dharma on reading those books. And he said he realized that he was a Buddhist and that he always had been a Buddhist. And from that, now what's really remarkable about his life, I think, is the fact that from that moment onwards, his whole life was devoted to the Dharma. First of all, to practicing in it, and then to teaching it. And he never wavered from that. Then came the Second World War, and he was conscripted. And as luck would have it, he was posted to India, the birthplace of the Buddha. And he was really delighted about that posting. And while he was still in the army, while he was still serving, whenever he had free time, he went out into India to try and find out more about Buddhism. Unfortunately for him, there wasn't an awful lot of Buddhism in India at that time. And but he tried, and then he left the army before the end of the war. Technically, he deserted, but I don't think they minded because the war was ended. And he teamed up with an Indian friend of his, and they together left home. Formally, they went forth from home life into the homeless life, and literally they did that and wandered around India for 2 years looking for Buddhist teachers, and they never found one in the whole of that time. And as I was saying last night, they found many Hindu teachers, and they learnt from those Hindu teachers, and Bhante was very appreciative of those teachers, and he regarded a few of them very, very highly as spiritually realized beings. But he still was absolutely sure that he wanted to find Buddhism. He wanted to find a Buddhist teacher. And eventually he was ordained into the Theravada tradition. And then he met, in a way, his first real Buddhist teacher was Jagdish Kashyap, who was a Pali scholar and a Buddhist monk at a university. I can't remember which university it was at now, but he was at the university. And Sangharakshita became his disciple and lived with him and learnt from him, learnt Pali from him, and learnt the Dharma from him too. He was really appreciative. And one day he decided that he realized that just practicing the Dharma himself was not enough. He needed to give himself up to the Dharma. He needed to let go of his own self in a way. And he thought, how can I do this? And he came to the conclusion that what he really needed to do was give himself over to Jagdish and do whatever Jagdish Kashyap wanted him to do, which was a bit awkward for both of them, because Jagdish Kashyap was a very, very humble man, and he wasn't the kind of guy who would tell people what to do, so they both had to get used to that. And one day they went travelling. I think it was during the summer holidays, if they have such thing in India. They must do, mustn't they? The time off from university, they went travelling. And one of the places they went to was Kalimpong in the foothills of the Himalayas. And they went there, and there were a few Buddhists there. And Jagdish Kashyap left, and he said, I want you to stay here and work for the good of Buddhism. And so Sangharakshita did that. And there lies a long tale, which I won't go into now, but it's well worth reading the Bhante's memoirs of that time. They're really, really remarkable. His devotion to the Dharma, his one-pointed devotion to the Dharma throughout the whole of that time was really remarkable. Even though some of his experiences on meeting some Buddhists were really quite unpleasant and not good, he never wavered in his devotion to the Dharma. And he during that time he began to teach as well. The few Buddhists that were in Kalimpong, he began to teach them and set up a young man's Buddhist association, and he just did whatever he could. In a lot of his time he spent up in Kalimpong, and he loved living there quietly, getting on with his Dharma practice and doing some teaching, and of course some writing as well. He founded a magazine, a Buddhist magazine, and did all sorts of things. And there were times when he just went right back into the plains of India and travelled around teaching. And as we know, Dr. Ambedkar was very active during that time. And Bhante met Dr. Ambedkar, and they had some very interesting meetings. Then, of course, Dr. Ambedkar died, and Bhante kind of had a premonition the day before. He didn't know why, but he just knew he had to go to a certain city, the name of which I can't remember at the moment. Nagpur, was it? Yeah. And Dr. Ambedkar died, and there were thousands upon thousands of Dr. Ambedkar's followers there, and Bhante spent days giving lectures and comforting them and so on, and pulling them together and saying, don't worry, even though Baba Sahib has died, you can carry on his work. So really remarkable. I want to say a few words, though, about when he came back to England, because he was very, as I was saying last night, he was very happy in Kalimpong. He had no desire to leave. It was just suited him really well. But he was invited to come back to England to help a rift between two Buddhist groups in this country, the English Sangha Trust and the Buddhist Society. And he came back and he did his best to try and heal that rift, but it was, really hard going. And he decided that he needed to stay in England, really. So he went back to Kalimpong just to tidy up his affairs and say goodbye to various people. And while he was there, he got this famous letter, or infamous letter, disinviting him. That's the phrase used, the word they use these days. Disinviting him from coming back. And he used to love telling this story. He was with his friend Terry Delamere, and he opened the letter and he read it and he showed it to Terry Delamere, and he said, "Do you know what this means?" And Terry didn't know what it meant. He said, "It means a new Buddhist movement in the UK." So that was a really big moment for him. So he came back and he began starting this new Buddhist movement, and hence here we are today. And last night I said, I posed a question: do you know how hard it is to start up a new religious movement? And of course we don't really know how hard it is to do such a thing, because we've never done that. We've probably never contemplated doing it, but it's a really hard thing to do, because it's one thing to give talks, it's one thing to write books, it's one thing to teach people, but to follow up year after year, decade after decade, and nurture a Buddhist movement and allow it to grow is a very, very hard thing to do. And I've observed Bhante do it for the past 40 odd years of my life. And it's something that we don't really talk about, and it's kind of an unsung aspect of his remarkable life, that he just nurtured this movement, and he was so careful with it. He was so careful, and at the same time he had this really big vision for our movement. He was always of the opinion that Buddhism could spread throughout the whole world and change the world. He was always of that opinion, never wavered from that idea. And his life, you could say, was devoted to bringing about that vision. And many of us, fell far, far short of that vision, and he was always trying to get us to see that it was possible. I remember one time in a question and answer session at Padmaloka, I can't remember what brought this about, but he was, we were questioning, could Buddhism really spread throughout the whole world? And he said, yeah, it can. And he said, just look, you just need to look at history and see what happens. I mean, who would have ever predicted what happened in India? The dying out of Buddhism. And then in the last so many years, so many decades, the flowering of Buddhism once again in India. Who ever would have predicted that? He said, you just cannot predict what's going to happen. So he was always had this huge vision for our movement. I think I just want to say a few words about some of the things he did for our movement. One of the things he did was he thought deeply about it. And he always thought before doing something. And whenever things happen, because things are always happening, when you've got a movement with centres all over the place, there are always things happening. He gets to hear about them and he thinks about them. And there was a time when he was very, very active. I mean, I knew him when he was a really active, suppose he was middle-aged, young to middle-aged when I first knew him, and he had so much energy. It's remarkable the amount of energy he had on all different levels. He was firing on all cylinders in those days. And he would get minutes from council meetings of various centres, and he was really active with those minutes. I remember one time he got the minutes and it said, "It was decided that something, something." And he wrote to them and said, "What do you mean it was decided? Who decided that? Things don't just get decided, people decide. So who decided?" So he's really, really keen on taking responsibility for one's decisions. And I remember, actually, I was at Padmaloka. I must have been in between retreats, I can't remember, but I was in the library looking something up. And that was the place when Subhuti was Bhante's secretary. They would meet every morning to look at the mail and talk about any issues that had come up. So they came in and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, shall I leave?" And Bhante said, no, you can stay there doing that if you want. So they just had this meeting in the corner. And an issue had arisen at the LBC because they had these 3 houses. They bought these 3 houses on Approach Road and next to each other. And there was a women's community in one, and there was a plan for a men's community to be in the other. And there was some consternation with the LBC Council about whether that was a good idea to have a men's and women's community right next to each other. And so Sabuchi said, look, they're wondering whether that's a good idea. And Banti went, I don't know if you know, have you ever seen Banti in this mode, thinking mode? But he goes, I think he does that just to let you know he hasn't wandered off. You know, he's still thinking about it. And he said, I think we have to treat people as grown-ups. So, you know, let them do as they think best. I was, as you know, as you can see, I was very, very impressed by that. I thought, wow, he's not going to tell people what to do. Treat everyone as grown-ups. I was saying last night, actually, that he treated us so well. He had such faith in us. And in my opinion, especially when you look back, if you ever read some of those seminars from the early days, it's worth reading. You can get them on Free Buddhist Audio. Just find one of the early seminars. And he's with a bunch of people, partly order members, partly mitras, I think. And you can see him trying to teach these people. And of course, they're contributing. And some of their contributions, you read them and you think, oh my God, how did he manage to teach these people? They were kind of all over the place and had some really strange ideas. And patiently, he just used to just carry on and correct people and show them, no, that doesn't really work, and so on. Really remarkable. The thing is that we kind of get used to it, don't we? We're used to our movement. We're used to the Manchester Buddhist Centre, and perhaps you're even used to Adhisthana now. We're used to just the way it works and so on, and we like it on the whole. But actually, it's a really remarkable Buddhist movement. It's something that we don't often really consider because we get so used to it. So I was saying last night how hard it must be to start up a Buddhist movement and nurture it, and especially when it starts going all over the world. But what's one of the really remarkable things about the Buddhist movement that Sangharakshita began was that it is unlike any other Buddhist movement, as far as I know, in history, in that it's neither monk nor lay. Now, I don't know of any other Buddhist movement or order that has such a thing. It's neither monk nor lay. And Banti thought it was really important to do this because he had experience in India and Sri Lanka of what he called the bifurcation of the Sangha into two levels. There was the monk level, and it was the monk level in those days. There were no nuns around in those days, not in the Theravada tradition. The monastics and the lay followers. And he considered that the relationship between the two was really unhelpful and unhealthy, that the lay followers weren't really expected to practice the Dharma. Their duty was to support the monks in their practice of the Dharma. And he thought that was not a good thing at all. And he also got to know a number of monks, and he wasn't impressed with their practice of the Dharma. So the whole thing had become very institutionalized. And he was really clear he didn't want that to happen in this country, in the UK, when he started this movement, and in the West, and in the world as a whole. So this movement is neither monk nor lay. The order is neither monk nor lay, so you can join the order as a lay follower or a monk or a nun. That is to say, you can take the vows of celibacy, etc., or not. And he was really, really clear about that commitment is primary. Your commitment to the three jewels is the primary thing, and the way you live that out is secondary. Not unimportant, but secondary. And that is unheard of, as far as I know, in the whole 2,500 years of Buddhist history. I don't know of that happening anywhere else. And another remarkable thing is the ordination for men and women is equal. There's no different kind of ordination for women as for men, unlike most other traditions. And the one I know mostly is the Theravada tradition, and there are many more rules that the nuns have to take that the monks don't. And the nuns have to look up to the monks in the Theravada tradition. That's just the way it is. And that isn't the case, as you know, in our order. That doesn't happen at all in our order. Yeah, so he didn't want to perpetuate that very unhealthy split between the monks and the lay. Yeah. And then, here's another remarkable thing. Our Buddhist movement is ecumenical, meaning that we're not wedded to any particular Eastern tradition. So we're not Hinayana, we're not Mahayana, we're not Vajrayana, yet we are all three in a way. And we're not Theravada, and we're not Sarvastivada, we're not Madhyamaka, we're not Yogacara, we're not Gelugpa or Nyingmapa or any of that. We are Buddhists. First and foremost, we're Buddhists. And the only other Buddhist order that I know that has done that is the Tibetan Rimé tradition, which tried to unify the four Tibetan traditions. That's the only other precedent that I know. And Sangharakshita was really, really clear that, you know, we are Buddhists and we follow the Buddha's teaching, but not in the way that perhaps the Theravada follow the Buddhist teaching and think this is the real teaching and everything else is a degeneration. No. Bhante was really clear that everything in the Buddhist tradition is of great value to us and we should follow that. Not in a cherry-picking kind of way, but in a very careful, considerate and critical way. We need to learn from all Buddhist traditions. And then, of course, his particular presentation of the Dharma. And what I mean by that is, of course, he taught the traditional presentation of the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Five Spiritual Faculties, and then from the Mahayana tradition, the six paramitas, and so on and so on. He drew from all the Buddhist traditions, but he had his own particular teachings, not because he was trying to be clever or anything, and he referred to himself many times as a conservative. He wasn't by nature radical. He's or innovative. He's by nature conservative. But when he came back to this country and he saw people and he saw them trying to practice, he realized they needed something a bit different from the traditional teaching. So, and we're so used to those teachings, we don't even think about how radical it was for Bhante to come up with those. And one of the most radical teachings of Bhante was the idea of the individual and the group. Now, that had never been done in Buddhism before, never. The idea that you needed to think for yourself, take responsibility for yourself, and not just go along with group norms and so on. That was new, really new. What else? The importance of spiritual friendship and community. Now, usually in the East, when they talk about Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, the Sangha jewel are enlightened beings who have practiced the Buddhist tradition and become enlightened. And of course, Bhante knew that, but what he really stressed was community and friendship amongst ourselves, which was the Buddha mentioned a few times in the Pali Canon, but it's easy to overlook those things and has been overlooked for hundreds of years in the Buddhist tradition, but he really brought it to the fore. And we are the lucky recipients of that, the fact that friendship is really, really important and community is really, really important. We've gained so much from that. I'm guessing I must be towards the end of my time, am I?
Yeah.
Yes. So, I want to just mention one last thing. And I've talked about this a few times recently because I was so excited when I found it. I thought this is a real find. I found it in the Pali Canon. And sometimes when you read through the Pali Canon, you find things which no one's ever told you about before because it's so big. And so this was in the Samyutta Nikaya and the beginning of the Kanda Samyutta, where the Buddha is teaching over and over again to different sets of people all about the skandhas, the five skandhas. And it begins with this old man, an old and sick man called Nakalapittu. And he goes to see the Buddha and he says, "Blessed one, Bhagava, I'm old and I'm sick. Can you give me a teaching specifically for me, please?" So the Buddha does. Now, I'm not going to tell you what that teaching was right now. You can look it up yourself. I've told you where to find it. But what's remarkable is after that happens. So the the Buddha gives Nakalapittu the teaching, and he thanks him, and they go their separate ways. Then Shariputra comes along, and he sees Nakalapittu sitting there, and he says, "Wow, you look really bright. Your skin is golden, you're shining. Has the Buddha been giving you a teaching?" And Nakalapittu says, "Yes, the Buddha has just sprinkled me with the deathless, or has just anointed me with the deathless ambrosia." Now, this is the thing that really got me, and I thought, wow. So I looked up in the Pali canon, in the Pali English dictionary, finding the Pali words for it. And sprinkled is abhisito, which means sprinkled, but it also means anointed. It means consecrated, like when someone becomes a king or a queen, they're consecrated with the kingdom kind of thing. So it has all these connotations, and those of you who have been ordained or have been present at an ordination ceremony know that at a certain point there's the vase. What's it called? The ordination vase?
Initiation.
The initiation, but the initiation, that's another word for abhisito. And at a certain point you bend forward in front of your preceptor, and they pour a few drops of this water on the crown of your head, and that represents the Dharma, that represents the deathless. And so this is what Nakalapittu felt at the end of this teaching by the Buddha, that he'd been anointed, sprinkled with the deathless. And the deathless is amata, beyond death, non-death. And of course, the later tantric tradition followed this through with the abhisheka, which is the initiation into a particular yidam, a particular bodhisattva figure. And so that really got me, that teaching, and it really hit me very hard, and I thought, that's it. That's what Bhante has done. That's what Bhante's done for me personally. He sprinkled me again and again and again with the deathless. And I feel profoundly grateful for him having done that. And he's done it for all of us in principle. If you want to bend down in front of him, allow him to pour the deathless on the top of your head, you can have that experience, because he's made it abundantly easy to be taught by him. And I think that that's what he's done with the movement, actually. The fact that he has died now doesn't matter. It matters to us personally if we knew him, but it doesn't matter so much for the movement, because he sprinkled the movement thoroughly with the deathless.